Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey, Pat Flynn here. Welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show, and for Sunday School, I have a special episode. I am going to be sharing with you an interview I did on the Classical Theism podcast with John DeRosa. He invited me on to share my story of how I went from a sort of skeptical atheist to a full embrace of supernaturalism and eventually made my way into the Catholic Church. And I get to unpack this story in a way that I don't usually get to explore it. So I think you might find it interesting, and especially if you're somebody who is seeking and curious, or perhaps you have some doubts or some skepticism yourself, then I think you'll find this something you can relate to, and hopefully you'll even get a few insights from it. Then the second part of the interview focuses on my book and the religious components that one can pull out of it, specifically how we can use principles from my book, How to Get Better at Almost Everything, for having productive religious conversation with people, and how so much of that comes down to forming relationships and really sharing what I believe is the most wonderful gift that you could ever share with somebody, which is getting them to see and genuinely believe that God loves us, that God loves them. And this was a gift that I somehow received totally undeservedly, and that I'm trying my best to make known in all the best ways that I can on these Sunday School episodes. So that is coming up in a couple of minutes, and I think you'll also, and I would highly recommend checking out John's podcast, Classical Theism. He's dedicated to establishing the rationality and coherence of a classical theism worldview, and he's had some amazing guests. In fact, a number of guests that I've had on my show as well. So if you've enjoyed, for example, my conversations with people like Dr. Ed Fazer, definitely go listen to the parallel episode that John had with Dr. Fazer, because it builds on a lot of the stuff that I talked about with him, but explores different material as well. So if you've gotten something out of Sunday School here, I cannot recommend John's podcast enough. It's really great stuff. There's that cough. It still yet lingers. So that's coming up in just a few minutes. One thing I wanted to do before that is start a new tradition on Sunday School. This will be short, but I think this will be enriching. Is a gospel reflection, a weekly gospel reflection, where I'll read something from the Bible and just offer a little commentary on it. Every Thursday, I go to a men's gospel reflection. Thursday morning, it's a wonderful group of guys. It's incredibly enriching just to sit in a room of men and just have deep, rich spiritual conversation. And sometimes we argue. Sometimes we get into some good debates about things, but always in a spirit of charity and goodwill and I've found that to be such a, having community like that, and being able to just reflect on these types of things is something that has become one of the most important and, like I said, enriching parts of my life. And I wanted to share something like that with you, even in a small way. So I'm going to go back to a gospel that was read. I'm going to kind of follow the Catholic schedule here, but I'm going back to last week's reading on Sunday, Gospel of John, and this is of course the how would I say, the famous story, as if there's not like a famous story from the Bible, but the story of the woman caught in adultery, and I want to read that to you and offer just a little bit of commentary. So this is John chapter 8. So I'm just going to read it. It's starting from verse 53, and then I'll just offer a few words that particularly of things that always stand out to me. We'll cut that, and then we'll go into my interview with John DeRosa. So here we go. Let's read this. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law Moses commanded us to stone such. What do you say about her?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the eldest. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus looked up. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin any more." So there's obviously a ton that we could unpack from this reading. I think a few points to kind of bring out here is like just how wise and how clever Jesus is. I mean, there's so many instances of people trying to trap him, of trying to argue with him, and he's always a step ahead of his detractors or people trying to corner him. And this is another great example of that, where they bring forth this woman, and of course how they ever found her or caught her in the act of adultery is something that one can speculate on, like what kind of windows. But whatever that is, they bring her forward, and they obviously know that Jesus is an extremely merciful and compassionate man. So they're trying to kind of see if they can catch him, either being unmerciful or going against the law of Moses, or going against tradition. So we all can see what the intention here is, and we don't have to see it. It's stated explicitly that they were trying to catch him. But in a very clever and subtle way, Jesus simply says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And what are you going to do there? What can you do? They obviously all just walk away. And of course, there's a ton that can be said about that, about judgment, about what are you going to do there? What can you do? They obviously all just walk away. And of course, there's a ton that can be said about that, about judgment, about holding ourselves to the same standard that we would hold other people to. And I think that's all really important stuff to reflect on, and we can certainly visit that in other readings. It brings you back to the "Judge not, lest ye be judged thyself." And part of that is not that we can or shouldn't ever make judgments. It's that if we're going to make judgments, then we better be ready to be judged by the same standard which we are judging others. That's really what that means, is that if we're going to make judgments, then get ready, because you will be held to that same exact standard. So we're seeing something like that, again, being demonstrated here. Jesus he's not saying don't stick around in a very clear way. He says, okay, whichever one of you is without sin, the perfect man among any of you, you step forward and go ahead and cast the first stone. So again, extremely wise, extremely clever, and he finds these ways to not just work his way out of what seems like a pretty well thought trap, but he does so in a way that he's teaching something very, very deep and very, very true and very, very fundamental. But here's the thing that really stands out at me is these last couple of lines. Jesus looked up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one, Lord." And Jesus says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again." Now, this is the part I really want to reflect on, because it affirms two things to me. One is the unconditional mercy, compassion, and love of Jesus, that whenever we want, the mercy of God is always on tap. It's always available, no matter what we do, no matter when we did it. It's unconditional. God's mercy is extreme. But, and here's the key point. It wasn't that Jesus said, "Oh, I don't condemn you. Go forth. Do whatever you want." No, he says, "Neither do I condemn you, and do not sin again." Do not sin anymore. So in contrast or in balance to that unconditional mercy is also this extremely high call to holiness, this extremely high standard, if you will, to live a holy life as far as you possibly can, to be perfect. Like, you have Jesus here, and I would say with Christianity, that are reflected in this one simple statement. You have God who is extreme in his standard, who calls us all to holiness, but you also have God who is extreme in his mercy. And that is what really strikes me about this. He's not just forgiving her. He's not just saying, I don't condemn you. He's calling her to holiness. He specifically says, do not sin again. Do not go back and keep committing adultery. And that seems right to me. That seems absolutely right, that God has high standards, high expectations, and that he is there to help us. He does not expect us to do this alone. In fact, it's explicitly taught that we cannot do it alone. We need God's help to live a life of holiness, that we need to respond to God's grace, we need to cooperate with it, and it's through that loving, saving relationship that we can become holy, that we can turn away from. We're going to make mistakes. So to balance that is this unconditional, radical, and extreme mercy that God and Christ has for all of us. And I think it's just so beautifully reflected and issued in this gospel, and that's the primary thing I wanted to share with you. In that there's these two extremes: the extreme standard of trying to live a holy life of love for God and for others, and also at the same time, whenever we stumble, whenever we falter, that mercy and forgiveness is always there for us. So that's all. I'm going to leave that there, and we're going to cut over to the interview now. I hope you like this. If this is something that you think we should continue, these gospel reflections, just let me know. The best way to do that is support the show by leaving a review, sharing the episodes. That's how we continue to grow here. So thanks for tuning in, and I'm going to cut it over now. That's how we continue to grow here. So thanks for tuning in, and I'm going to cut it over now to my interview on the Classical Theism podcast with John DeRosa. Because I think a mistake that people make, and I'm pointing directly at myself, is they forget what apologetics is about. Apologetics is not about winning arguments. It's about saving souls. So you have to learn to put your ego aside, your pride aside, and realize that sometimes it's actually better not to make the argument.
Hi, I'm John DeRosa, and you're listening to the Classical Theism podcast, where we defend Catholic Christian ideas in conversation and love the God of classical theism with all of our heart and all of our mind. Welcome back to the Classical Theism podcast, where we glorify the God of classical theism and defend Catholic Christian ideas in conversation. Today I've got a bonus episode for you. I'm joined by Pat Flynn, who is a recent convert to Catholicism, a generalist, a smart guy, an athletic guy, and he's written a great book called How to Be Better at Everything, and stack skills, and a lot of different topics are covered, but we're going to apply that book in this interview to the project of apologetics. So I really wanted to have Pat on, and when we had this conversation, I realized he's really a genuine, awesome guy. He's on fire for the faith, and he loves learning about it and engaging with the faith and philosophy intellectually. Okay, you're not going to get a dumbed-down Catholicism from Pat Flynn. So he's going to tell you his conversion story. He's going to tell you a bit about his book, and then my favorite part, and you're going to love this, he's going to say how we can apply those principles, how to be better at everything. We can apply those principles to the practice of apologetics. So I really think you're going to enjoy this episode. Pat is a great guy. I hope to have him back on again. Keep an eye out for his name in the future, because he is doing awesome work. And at the end, I'll have the show notes page where you can get in contact with him or get on his email list and find out about the great things that he's putting out. And check out his podcast as well, because he's had some great Catholic minds, philosophers, physicists, molecular biologists on there talking about issues related to apologetics. So you'll really enjoy it. But without further ado, here's my bonus episode, an interview with Pat Flynn. I'm joined by Pat Flynn, who describes himself as a generalist who helps people get good at many things. He is a writer, philosopher, business coach, and fitness coach. He's also a black belt and a Catholic. He writes at chroniclesofstrength.com and is the author of 5 books, including the recent title, How to Be Better at Everything, where he teaches how to learn anything quickly, stack your skills, and dominate. Pat Flynn, welcome to the Classical Theism Podcast.
John, it is a delight to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Pat, you are quite the interesting guy who has written quite the interesting book. I'm really excited for this conversation, but can you just tell us more what got you interested in philosophy and religion in general, as well as Catholicism in particular? I'd love to hear that story.
Oh, sure. Well, I hope you have a comfortable seat, John, as well as your listeners, because this one takes me way back. I'm technically a Catholic revert. I was baptized Catholic, but I was brought up in a very nominal Catholic family. And at a very young age, I bought into that superficial conflict and narrative of some type of irreconcilable tension between faith on one side and reason and science on the other. I specifically remember it was in the 6th grade, and I first started hearing of the Big Bang Theory. I'm like, I don't think that's what I read about in the Bible, and it planted all these seeds of doubt. So it was a gradual process, but then I was also very much into writing and music growing up. Still am. Obviously, it's kind of what I do now at this point. And one of the writers who had a big influence on me, his name was H.L. Mencken. A lot of people might not be all that familiar with him today, but he was a pretty staunch atheist back in his day. And if I remember correctly, I believe he wrote the first English work of Nietzsche. I'm pretty sure about that, but that was one of his big influences. So Mencken led me to the old atheists, and that really spurred a lot of my. I feel like I was always kind of infested with the existential questions, but when I really got into philosophy, I was really into so many of those the old atheists, the good atheists, right? The good old atheists in many different ways. So I mean, they deeply influenced me. For many years, I would have considered myself an atheist. So this actually instilled in me not only a deep skepticism, but a very anti-religious attitude as well. And, looking back, I guess it's not all that, inconceivable. I'm a teenager. I'm wearing Megadeth t-shirts. I'm playing in rock bands. Right. So there's something rebellious about atheism. And I don't want to play this, the psychoanalysis game too much, but it's not, it's kind of obvious why that would be appealing to an adolescent. But here's the thing, as you grow up and you take philosophy more seriously, and I have the, kind of my type A OCD neurotic personality really likes to try and be thorough with things. Or you're familiar, John, right? I start I'm really diving into the atheistic worldview of metaphysical naturalism, trying to understand this, and as I do, as I move along and the years pass by, I'm kind of brought to a point of both nihilism and absurdity. And, one thinker who was pretty influential on me would be Alex Rosenberg and his Atheist Guide to Reality. And I like Rosenberg because I think he's one of the few contemporary, somewhat popular atheistic thinkers who's willing to drive atheism to its conclusions. And that's awesome. That's wonderful. It's not a superficial atheism. It's a deep, full-throated atheism. And that's helpful because to the extent that you are consistent from this starting point that only physical things exist, you are brought to just a party of absurdities. And that's exactly what happened to me, of having to believe that there was no such thing as meaning, to just a party of absurdities. And that's exactly what happened to me, of having to believe that there was no such thing as meaning or truth or enduring selves or even consciousness to begin with, right? With a lot of these eliminativists just taking the nuclear option and saying, well, we can't explain mind according to physical processes, so mind must not exist at all, right? And you're like, wait, hold on a minute. That just doesn't seem right. Consciousness can't be an illusion, because who's having the illusion then? So the point that I'm getting at, it wasn't actually a study of theism or theistic philosophers that brought me out of atheism originally. It was actually a deeper study of atheism itself that had me just so existentially confused and I'm like, this just cannot possibly be true. It can't. And even if it was true, apparently I wouldn't be able to know that it was true. So it's like, what the?
Taking the old atheists seriously, I think back to a couple blog posts I've read on Dr. Edward Fazer's blog where he discussed the old atheism and how like more intellectually robust and consistent they were. And he even calls Alex Rosenberg's book, An Atheist Guide to Reality, he calls that the best atheist book out of the new atheists. So you're in good company in appreciating that. They do take it to the edge. They do take it through consistently. But then you just see how ridiculous it is.
Yeah, so that's why it's helpful, and I'm a huge fan of Fazer. And later on in my journey, he was, and I told him this when he was on my show. I just got to personally thank him. I'm like, thank you for your work, because you're one of the people that I was able to turn to once I reached these absurdities and see the counter arguments. And that's pretty much what happened at that point, John. Is I'm like, okay, if I'm reaching all these absurdities, I need to go back and check my starting point, right? I need to go back and think about the sort of grand metaphysical worldview again. So I started, kind of widening my philosophical Boethius, those guys. And I'll condense the story a bit here. I got to Aquinas. Aquinas leads me to people, contemporary people like Fazer, Dr. Robert Spitzer, Father Robert Spitzer, I should say. Also just a walking brain and a wonderful man. And that brought me into theism, hands down. I'm like, yep, God, that makes sense now. Thank you for that clarity. That's awesome. But I didn't become a Christian or a Catholic right away. And part of that was I would say almost all of it was deeply emotional. I came up with these old atheists. I was a very rebellious person for a while, and I just spewed venom all over. So it would have been too embarrassing for me, John. Honestly, it would have been too much egg on my face to go from where I was to a Christian or a Catholic. So I kind of took a tour in the spiritual but not religious department for a while, practiced a lot of Buddhism and Zen because it allowed me to start, being spiritual but without feeling like I was taking on too many metaphysical, not religious department for a while. Practice a lot of Buddhism and Zen because it allowed me to start, being spiritual, but without feeling like I was taking on too many metaphysical commitments or things like that. As I was being open-minded, if you will. And the funny thing, and I guess it's just another irony, and it does show that God has a wonderful sense of humor, is that it was through a Zen teacher who was giving a teaching or a course on Christ. It was like this 8-hour audiobook, because everybody's got a perspective on Jesus, right? That and they're looking at him through a kind of enlightened monk, spiritual guru type of, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. That's just what you get in the sort of new agey environment. But what that did was it got me really interested in Jesus, and it actually caused me the first time in my life to go, maybe I'll go pick up a Bible, maybe I'll go read a New Testament. And what happened is I famously encountered within like 10 to 15 minutes of just flipping through reading some Mark and Matthew, firstly stumbled into the famous C.S. Lewis trilemma argument way before I ever read Lewis, where I'm like, okay, this guy he's either a crazy person by the claims he's making, he's either an insane charlatan, which doesn't seem to make sense because I don't see who would believe him or why he would make this up, or there's actually something to what he said. There's actually something to his claims. And then finally, I'm like, this guy is just Jewish. They're calling him rabbi. He's talking about fulfilling the law, not abolishing the law. So where are you getting all this? It's not like he was like, hey, guys, just got back from a week-long yoga retreat. Let me teach you this cool meditation and we can get out of this Judaism stuff. So I'm like, how ridiculous these perspectives. And I was kind of angry. I felt like it was a big bait and switch of all these kind of spiritual courses on Jesus I was taking. And I'm like, that's it. I'm going all in on this question. That leads me to the work of people like N.T. Wright, William Lane Craig, studying the historical case for the resurrection. I know you talk about on this question. That leads me to the work of people like N.T. Wright, William Lane Craig, studying the historical case for the resurrection. I know you talk about that on your podcast, and you do a wonderful job. So I'm not going to repeat the arguments. Let's just say it convinced me. Yep, Christianity is true, but God, just don't let Catholicism be true. That just cannot be anything but that. You've humiliated me enough. Just don't. So I'm going to Lutheranism. I'm going to evangelical congregations, and it's just too much doctrinal inconsistency. Nobody can agree on anything that the Bible says. So I start looking at the Catholic objections to sola scriptura. I start looking at church history. I start reading Clement, Ignatius, Irenaeus, and sure enough, it's Catholic right at the very beginning. I couldn't get around it. So I actually wound up getting confirmed last Easter. My wife had her own conversion experience. She got baptized last Easter and is getting confirmed.
And I'm so happy to hear those details, Pat, and have you share them with the listeners. Just a couple quick comments, and we're going to dive into your awesome book, but it's just so cool because you really follow the three pillars that we talk about here, and I know you talk about on your podcast as well, which we'll talk about later, but how, if these three things are true, if the God of classical theism exists, if Jesus is really the Lord and Messiah, and if he founded the Catholic Church, well, then Catholicism is true, and we need to embrace it. And I think your story kind of followed those three pillars, which is pretty cool. I love your investigation into Jesus, how you kind of figured it out yourself, at least initially, the Lord, Liar, Lunatic thing. I got a hypothesis that this is why the mythicism is going to continue to swell. In my opinion, it's going to become even more popular going forward because it's the Lord, Liar, Lunatic trilemma is so good. It's so powerful. Once you actually come to grips with it, you're like, this is a serious figure. You can't have some kind of wishy-washy interpretation. You're like, this is a serious figure. You can't have some kind of wishy-washy interpretation unless you just say, oh, no, none of it happened. It's all bunk. Because if you take seriously some of the claims that he makes in the New Testament, you have to take him seriously, Lord, Liar, or Lunatic. So I think that's going to swell going in the future. And the last thing I just want to tell the audience, too, I've listened to you. You didn't just, peek into these books. You read through N.T. Wright's Resurrection of the Son of God. That thing is a tome. I've heard
it's like 800 some pages. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, I've read a lot of William Lane Craig stuff. I've read some other popularizers. I've never gone into that tome just because it's very intimidating. But I just want the audience to know this was not a superficial conversion. You had to check everything out thoroughly for yourself. And it's just really cool to hear that story of you going through those pillars. So go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I'll say just a couple things about it. I was joking with Father Spitzer about this the other day. Is like, look, life is a slog anyways. So if you're going to slog through anything, this is kind of the stuff that's worth slogging through. We're talking about the biggest questions in life. That said, I found Wright's book fairly. It's long, but it's accessible. It definitely is. And for me, I just had to know. I had to check every doubt, every skepticism, all of it. So I just wouldn't be satisfied with anything less at that point. Do I think it's necessary for most people? Yeah, no, I think there's a lot more popular books that can certainly satisfy that. But yeah, it's just part of my personality. It's a total defect.
No, it's not. It's great. It's going to be helpful to us, and I wanted the audience to know that. So when they hear you talking about your current book, this is well-researched stuff. These are good principles. The kind of stuff Pat talks about in his book is going to save us a ton of time. So Pat, your new book, it's got quite the ambitious title, How to Be Better at Everything, or How to Be Better at Almost Everything. Can you give us an overview of what it's about?
Well, which I know we're going to try to do here in a bit. But the book is tilted towards entrepreneurs, but it's accessible, I think, for pretty much anybody who's seeking to just be better at various things in life. And my thesis is pretty simple, that in today's world, in today's economy, and for most humans most of the time, you're better off getting good to great, or at least fairly competent at a lot of different things, and then combining those skills to form competitive and creative advantages in life, rather than trying to be the best in the world at any one thing. And this wasn't something that that I planned out from the beginning. It was really an idea that I more or less stumbled into through a series of failures. So I'm not kidding when I say that I have a very type of OCD, neurotic personality and it first manifested. I hate using that word manifest, but sorry about that. It first became evident when as a young musician, I was playing guitar. It first became evident when as a young musician, I was playing guitar. I'd play for 7 to 8 hours a day. I wanted just to be like the fastest person on the fretboard. I wanted to be the most pyrotechnic musician. But then I would do these battle of the bands and stuff like that, and I would always lose. And I would always lose to people who weren't as technical on the guitar as me, but they could do other things, right? So I could do a little pyrotechnic phrase here and there, but this other guy could play a guitar fairly well, but he could sing, he could dance, he could entertain a crowd. And it was that general stacking of skills that was more appealing to people than me just being a hardcore specialist, which was only of limited appeal, mostly to other specialists. So I didn't first learn the lesson then. Of course, I just kept going in my ignorant ways. But then when I got into college and I started getting into martial arts and fitness as really a way to just kind of pay my tuition bills, I didn't really think it would turn into anything like it did, at least not at first. I started blogging about it. I started blogging about it. I started creating content about kettlebells and weight training and martial arts and this and that. And I started getting a lot of attention. And this made me curious because I'm like, well, hold on. I'm not the biggest guy. I'm not the strongest guy. I'm not the fastest. I'm not the leanest. Like I'm in good shape. I could do some cool things in the gym. So what's going on here? And over time, I began to realize it wasn't the fact that I was the best at anything, because I wasn't, that was allowing me to gain some traction as an online content creator and eventually online business owner. It was the fact that I was good enough at a bunch of different things. For example, I had my background in writing, combined that with fitness, and it made my content entertaining, accessible to people, that they didn't really care if I was the biggest, strongest, or leanest. I was able to teach them things in an informative and entertaining way. Combine that with a knowledge of copywriting and being able to write some like catchy headlines and understanding various, tricks of the trade and social media. And that's when I began to really kind of obsessed with trying to be the best at a lot of things and never quite succeeding. Ironically, the parts where I did have success was where I wasn't the best at anything, but gained at least, again, either a general or mild competence across a lot of different things, or was good to great. So that's the primary argument I present in the book, and then I dive into details of skill development and stacking and stuff from there.
I really love it, and I definitely think it's going to be applicable to those of us who want to defend the faith. But I just want to talk about your first chapter real quick, because I love the title. It says, "When Great is the Enemy of Good." What's that all about? Honestly, I feel like it describes much of my thinking for most of my life. I just would put stuff off. And, honestly, I still do it because I know I'm not going to be good at it right away. So I'll just put it off. I'm not going to do it. What's that chapter about?
Yeah, well, it's about everything I just described in all those lessons, but also everything that you're talking about. And it's exactly what happened to me. So we might think, don't let great be the enemy of good, or also don't let perfect. And humans, and this is especially evident in the fitness and nutrition industry, but I think it applies to pretty much everything. When they're looking at different challenges, when they're really trying to improve themselves, they tend to fall in this all or nothing or black and white mindset. Somebody starts a diet. It's going well for the first 5 days. Then they have a little slip up on the 6th day, and they're like, that's it. Throw their hands up in the air. I quit. I'm going back to the way I was, maybe even worse. And that's really deleterious because what happens is it starts to undermine confidence. It starts to undermine faith in yourself, and then you're less likely to really start something again, and certainly far more likely to quit it if you keep on perpetuating this perfectionist attitude. So we don't want to let what is ideal get in the way of what is practical. And certainly that's true for content creation. I mean, all the times I never hit publish because I just didn't think something was perfect, and how much that has cost me in time and productivity now looking back. It can't even be quantified, or probably could. I can't do it anyways. So I guess the aside from being a generalist, the point I'm trying to make is look, first off, you're never going to improve unless you get started. So and everything sucks the first draft, right? Everything is terrible the first time you do it. Nobody got on a bike and was great at riding at the start. So you have to swallow that, and you have to get over it, whether it's podcasting, here's an example. How about prayer life? That was something I never did before.
I was just going to bring that up because honestly, so many times I've been like, okay, I'm going to make a new prayer routine where I'm going to do I'm going to wake up extra early. I'm going to do a half hour in the morning, and I'll do it for 3 days, and then I'll miss it on the 4th day. I'll be like, oh, I can't do this.
Yep. It's just like a diet, isn't it? And I fall into it, the same thing myself. I have to keep returning to this because, as I was, converting and reading about all these saints, so it was very intimidating in the same way that going into the gym for the first time was intimidating before I really started getting serious about working out. But it comes back to this idea of little and often over the long haul. Don't let great be the enemy of good. Just get started. I'm with you, John. I'm doing this Exodus 90 thing now, which is a real challenge. And sometimes I'm failing. Sometimes I'm missing out. But I commit to at least something every day. So get rid of all or nothing. Just think always something. It's worked for me well so far, and I'm sticking. I'm just going to stick with it.
I love it. And I honestly, I start playing that mantra in my head now. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be something, just do the next right thing. Just do something good, even if it stinks the first time. And I love it. I think for us, at the Classical Theism podcast, we're aiming to equip people to go out and defend Catholic Christian ideas in conversation. And I'll tell you, the first time you do that, or you probably get yourself into a discussion, it's probably going to be really hard if you never do that sort of thing and never talk about religion. At least me in New Jersey, it doesn't really come up unless self into a discussion. It's probably going to be really hard if you never do that sort of thing and never talk about religion. At least me in New Jersey, it doesn't really come up unless somebody's bashing the church. And, the first time you do it, it's going to be tough. But like Pat said, don't let perfection prevent you from taking that first good step. So let's dive more into your book, specifically how it might help us at the Classical Theism podcast. So as you know, we're aiming to improve in apologetics, in philosophy, and defending the Catholic Christian worldview. So I'm going to press you with a little bit more specific questions on this, and then we'll see how you take it. Does that sound good?
Please do.
All right. So first, what skills, because you're really good at identifying skills, what skills do you see as important for someone who wants to be a better defender of the faith? And what skills would you highlight so that they can be, quote, stacked? And maybe say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's actually two examples in my book that apply almost perfectly to apologetics and evangelization. And they're actually in the meta skill section. And the idea here is these are skills that every human should have at least a mild competency at least, because they're the types of skills that will only help everything else. They're force multipliers. You get these down, everything else is going to improve because of it. And those two skills would be logic and persuasion. And immediately, I think there's a connection there to apologetics. Logic, being able to arguments are not so good, but also help you to present arguments as well, which of course is just the very nature of apologetics. So having some type of foundational study there, and there's actually a fantastic little book that people can start with. It's called Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft. So you'll get an amazing crash course in logic if this is new to you. And it will be by one of the best Catholic philosophers. So I just can't recommend that starting point enough for people. And then
fantastic. And I just want to say real quick, I'll link to any of these resources that you mentioned, of course, as well as your book in the show notes page for this episode.
Great. Thanks, John. And the second is persuasion. Now, I think these two map on into what I consider the two branches of apologetics. Now, you identified the three, I call them the three rungs, right? Which is the kind of the minimum effect of apologetic is answering those three most important questions. But the two branches of apologetics are the matter, which is understanding the arguments, and the manner. And that's how you present them, which is understanding the arguments and the manner. And that's how you present them and how you form relationships with people. And I think, and this is the skill stack here, because I think a mistake that people make, and I'm pointing directly at myself, is they forget what apologetics is about. Apologetics is not about winning arguments. It's about saving souls. So you have to learn to put your ego aside, your pride aside, and realize that sometimes it's actually better not to make the argument. Sometimes it's better to form a friendship and a relationship. In fact, I would contend that almost always it's better to form a friendship and relationship, because at nothing else, it might delay making the argument, but almost always it will improve the chances of your argument being heard. And again, I'm pointing directly at myself for this as somebody who loved, if we buy into those Myers-Briggs personality tests, I always fall out as the debater. I love to argue. It's just the thing again. And when I talk about persuasion in my book, I say, look, the skill of persuasion is really the skill of friendship. That's what it is. Persuasion isn't and shouldn't be what most people think of, this kind of, smarmy used car salesman, oversized suit trying to get the better of people. It's taking a genuine interest in people, fostering a relationship. And no matter how opposed you are to somebody else, you might be Catholic, they might be the most ardent atheist in the world. There's something in common that you can agree on. And finding that thing in common, some of my best friends are atheists. And guess what? They're starting to warm up to religion because they like me and they like hearing my story. Whereas if we just were clashing online and never heard each other before, they'd just ignore me immediately. It would never have happened. And I've converted people who are atheists. I've converted somebody who was a Sikh because they know me, they like me, they trust me. And even though we disagree, we're able to have an argument. So I think if nothing else, okay, you can try and be the best in the world and grind these arguments to a pulp. And I think there's a time and place for studying that. But chances are you're probably not going to be a professional debater, right? You're probably not. And most of the time, most of the objections that people have to a Christian Catholic worldview are pretty bad. They're pretty bad. They're pretty easy to deal with. You don't have to be a hyper specialist to deal with them. You can just get fairly competent, and that's going to be enough. And then if you spend the rest of your time focusing on people skills, relational skills, persuasions, friendship, that stack alone, I promise you, I think would be far more effective than just being a hyper specialist on argument by itself.
Woo! Pat, you are blowing us away here with that great content. I love that distinction of the matter and the manner in which you present it. I have to say, because it's been my experience too in college. I was like obsessed with like the arguments and the logical side. But it really is true what you're saying, because if you have the best argument in the world, but if the person isn't open to hearing it, it really doesn't matter. Yeah, okay, your conclusion's valid, your premises are true, all that good stuff. But if they're not open to hearing it, it's not going to land. So you've really laid out a couple of big areas where we got to stack skills to be better defenders of the faith. I want to get real specific, though, for a second. Let's talk about God. Let's say someone has a month coming up when they know they're going to have some more free time, and they want to dive deeper into the God of classical theism and arguments for theism. They really want to bulk up in understanding that and being confident in presenting that. How could they begin? How could they use principles of your book to even approach this task? And how would we even know where to begin?
Yeah, so one of the principles of my book is this idea of integration over isolation, and that helps us to figure out where to begin. So you think of what your overall goal is, and you try to reverse engineer it from there. So if my goal is just to play some AC/DC songs on the guitar, then I don't need to spend time learning every single jazz chord and Phrygian mode that I can possibly think of. Like, that's actually going to be a waste of my time. I just want to play Back in Black or something like that. So, okay, I need to spend time isolating and learning E chords and D chords and some blues licks, and I'm pretty much going to have the foundations to pull off what I want to do. So you start with your goal. What's your goal? I want to have a stellar conversation, a convincing conversation with my Uncle Bart, who is a hardcore atheist, right? Great. That's fantastic, right? And Thanksgiving's coming up or whatever. You've got a month to prepare. So maybe you've heard some of Uncle Bart's objections before. Maybe you have a frame of reference. Okay, that's where you start. You figure out what's the integration. Maybe he read the Da Vinci Code. I mean, how common is that, right? Integration. Maybe he read the Da Vinci Code. I mean, how common is that, right? And I hope everybody understands that is a work of fiction, correct? But it goes back to my point, and I just had a conversation with somebody the other day, and that was their they just really thought the Da Vinci Code was some type of historically reliable document. But whatever it is, and maybe it's not that. Maybe he thinks that Jesus was a myth or borrowed from pagan or Greco-Roman mythology or something like that. Okay, whatever it is, that's your study area. And then that's what I would call in the book, your focus of short-term specialization. And the idea is, if you want to be a generalist, don't try and do everything at once. Use the idea of integration to focus on your goal, and then reverse engineer from there. And then you do want to short-term specialize. Like, if you really want to work something out, you should spend some time really focused in on that one area. So you can even do this with the 3 prongs of apologetics. Okay, I want to get really good at dialoguing with – then you're going to work on natural theology. Or I want to get really good at having arguments – charitable arguments with my friends that are of a spiritual but not religious persuasion. Fantastic. Let's look at the evidence for the resurrection. Okay, I've got a lot of friends that are Protestant. Most of my family's Protestant. Thanksgiving dinner's coming up. I need to know why the Catholic Church is true. There you go. You're going to short-term specialize in that. So understanding what your goal is, taking, I think, real-life situations that are either coming up or that you've been in previously, and then really owning in on those. And I think a month is actually a very reasonable period of time. You can get some books in, you can get some practice in, and that would be the other side of it. Aside from studying, get in some online debate groups. There's tons of online debate groups that are actually pretty decent. Some of them turn into a bunch of memery and foolishness, but you can find some decent ones out there of people who are, willing to actually have an argument, not just a fight. And that can be notes, see the objections, and then John, maybe you gave this because I am a fan of your show. Was this your tip? Because I thought it was so awesome and so true. You watch a debate, and if it is, I want to make sure you get full credit, and then you pause it at the objection and you try and answer it yourself. Was that you who gave that?
I don't know if that was me. It could be. I've heard that on Catholic Answers. I've heard Trent Horn say that, so I think it was him.
Maybe it was Trent, but whoever it was, I mean, that's rehearsal. That's That's what it is. I mean, that's all it is. And you need that for any skill. It's sparring, right? So you need the study, you need the isolated practice, but then you also need the rehearsal and the sparring. And you can use recorded debates to train yourself and practice responding in real time. So if you were going to do that and you had a month, that's how I would begin to focus in.
Those are some great skills, some great principles, Pat, that we can really apply to all areas if we want to dive into something more specifically. I love the reverse engineering thing too. Figure out what's your goal. A lot of times, in college and right after college, I would dive into something more specifically. I love the reverse engineering thing too. Figure out what's your goal. A lot of times, in college and right after college, I would just I was so interested in arguments for the faith because I hadn't heard them before previously. I just started buying these random books and learning little random pieces here, but I didn't have a clear goal. So it was hard, and I would forget stuff, and then I would, I'd want to know this, and you're just all over the place. Start with your goal and then work backwards from there. I like it. And you've got to go ahead. Yeah.
No, I would say, don't worry. You're not going to be able to retain everything all the time. I can spend, however many months learning a Dream Theater album on the guitar. But if I don't keep that up, I'm just not going to, I couldn't do that right now, right? I'll retain, maybe 50 to 60% of it or so. And same thing with arguments. So it's okay. Whatever your goal is at the time, whoever you're working with, whatever your evangelization process is, you have to get used to this idea of short-term specialization, and that's how you become a good generalist.
Realistic expectations, and like we said in the beginning, can't let perfect get in the way of good. And but the next thing I want to go to, Pat, and I'm so glad to ask you this question because you've got a chapter on skills that you may need but may not be interested in. And for example, here at the Classical Theism podcast, I encourage listeners to go out there, start creating their own content related to defending the faith, whether it's in blog or podcast form. Pick up on something they're interested in and go off of that. But, that can involve learning a bunch of techie stuff, annoying things on the internet that they don't want to bother learning. What kind of highlights can you give us from this chapter that might be relevant?
Yeah, what a thing, right? Because I'm right there with you. There's so many things that were necessary for being a content creator online that I wasn't altogether interested in. Actually, even just setting up audio equipment was one of them, which I have no excuse as a musician, but I've always just had other people do it for me. I'm like, all right, I'm actually going to take the time to learn this now. And it's a grind, but it's necessary. Let me give one specifically that I think is kind of universally applicable, that will help anybody, even though they might not have an initial interest in it. And that would be the skill of copywriting, or being able to write a good advertisement. And what this will enable you to do, even if you're not initially interested in it, is stand out and get attention in a noisy industry. And believe me, I know all about noisy industries. A lot of what I do is in the fitness industry. It could not be more populated. But part of the reason that I was able to get attention wasn't just because I was a good writer, but because I also learned about copywriting. I knew how to write catchy headlines, enticing bullet points, how to write effective advertisements, because I studied it. And I worked at it. I studied the great copywriters like Gary Halbert and read the books there's another book, How to Write a Good Advertisement. It's a wonderful book. So that's an important and somewhat secretive skill that I think is one that is, I can't evangelize. So yeah, I would say start thinking about looking up copywriting. I don't mean copyright in a legal sense. I mean copywriting in a marketing sense, in an advertising sense, of learning to use words that catch attention, words that grab interest, and stuff like that. So that would be my tip there.
All right, Pat. Well, you are the generalist. You've delivered so many awesome ideas to us today, and I just want to give you a chance to consolidate them. Can you give us, and this is a tough task, I'm sorry to throw this at you at the end, but hey, Dr. Tom Woods likes to do this on his show, and I know I've heard you on there as well. I want to hear the 1-minute summary, incorporating the philosophy of generalism. How can we become better defenders of Catholic Christian ideas using your philosophy? Just kind of consolidate things in about 1 minute and let us know.
All right, man. The pressure is on. I did not prepare for this one. I did not prepare my elevator speech. So here we go. Don't worry about being the best in the world. Just get good to great. All right, man. The pressure is on. I did not prepare for this one. I did not prepare my elevator speech. So here we go. Don't worry about being the best in the world. Just get good to great, or at least fairly competent at a lot of different things, and then combine your skills. And for apologetics specifically, understand that both the matter and the manner of apologetics matters. That if you want to be an effective evangelist, it's not just winning arguments, it's about saving souls. And that starts just as much with forming friendships as it does being able to advance philosophical arguments.
That was too good. You must have rehearsed that a little bit, but Pat Flynn, that was amazing. Thank you so much for joining us on the Classical Theism podcast. Please let the listeners know. I know I'm going to have links to the resources, all the books, everything you mentioned will be in the show notes page, but just let the listeners know where can they go to find out more about your work, and then we'll say goodbye.
Oh, well, thanks a ton, John. I appreciate it. Shortest distance from here to where I am would be Chronicles of Strength. I blog fairly regularly. My email list is where you'll hear from me the most, and you can get on that right at my website. I have a collection of, if you're into kettlebells, I have a whole thing of kettlebell workouts that you can get for free. But on my email list, I also talk philosophy and theology and stuff like that. It really is a generalist newsletter, so I'd recommend that. And then my podcast, The Pat Flynn Show on iTunes. I usually do at least one philosophy episode a week. Sunday school, as the name implies, is usually very, very Catholic. And then have all sorts of episodes ranging from fitness to business to writing to create to everything else that you can think of is over on The Pat Flynn Show. So those would be the two spots that I'd send people to.
Fantastic. Well, we will definitely link to those in the show notes page. And Pat, I really recommend people listen to your podcast. I love the Sunday school episodes. He's got a great interview with Dr. Fazer. He's got 2 long interviews with Father Roberts. Listen to your other episodes that weren't even Sunday school. Really good content. So keep up the great work, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, John.
All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed that interview. The show notes link for the episode is classicaltheism.com/Flynn, and that's Flynn, Flynn, classicaltheism.com/Flynn. Definitely check out the show notes link. We'll have links to his book, links to some other books that we mentioned, by N.T. Wright. There's another book that he is slogging through right now. Pat Flynn, he loves just tackling these intense, heavy books in philosophy, theology, and apologetics. He's going through Bernard Lonergan's Insight. And so I'll have a link to that in the show notes page. We chat a little bit about that. And, just a lot of great stuff. So check that out. Check out his podcast, his website, chroniclesofstrength.com. And I think you're going to see a ton of content that as a Catholic interested in defending the faith, you can get a lot out of listening and reading what Pat Flynn has to offer. So I hope you have a great week. I hope you like this bonus episode, a little bonus content. And next Monday, we'll have our next piece of content out there for you, our regularly scheduled episode. I hope you are defending the faith, friends. I hope you have a good conversation with someone this week. Give them a good reason, to believe in God or to believe in Jesus or to think that he founded the Catholic Church, or at least this. Let me add one more thing. I'm always adding things in. I was having a conversation. You'll see a lot of people just kind of assume that the Catholic worldview is false and then attack it or then act like, they have these great reasons against it. I was even talking to someone in my family and they're like, the Catholic Church shouldn't tell you how to live. What are these, who are they to tell you how to live? Well, think about that objection for a second. Why shouldn't the Catholic Church tell you how to live? It's almost as, the church is kind of just making up rules and it's them just, telling you how to live to control you. But what if it's Jesus' church? What if God exists? Jesus is our Lord and Messiah, and he founded the Catholic Church so that we could know how to live, so that we could be happy in this life and the next. If that's the purpose of the church and undergirds all of her rules and regulations and teachings on virtue, then who else is going to tell us how to live? Let's let the scientists tell us how to live. Let's let the politicians tell us how to live. I mean, seriously, who would you rather have tell you how to live than God, Jesus, and his church? So, just little objections like that, they kind of tend to assume that your worldview is false. So if you can have a good conversation this week, just plant a seed. You don't have to, go to the mat with that person arguing, really rigorously. Just plant something that you wouldn't normally say. If someone throws out an objection, well, why not? Why do you think that? And just pursue that a little bit. You can do this, friends. We're gonna keep practicing defending the faith together. I know I bumble around all the time in real world conversations and conversations on social media, but we are aiming to get better. As Pat Flynn taught us, doesn't need to be perfect. Okay, we're gonna go good to great. Just getting a little bit better. Don't let perfection stand in the way of getting a little bit better. Okay, sorry for that long rant. I hope you're having a good week, and I hope you have a great weekend coming up. And please know that I'm praying for you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.